In the mystical realm where ancient territories are carved between supernatural races, where werewolf packs maintain their rigid hierarchies and vampire covens rule from shadowed castles, there lived a young Omega named Elias Thornwick. Born into one of the lowest-ranking clans of the Moonhaven Pack, Elias had always known his place in the world was precarious. His family held no significant territory, commanded no great respect, and possessed no legendary bloodlines that might elevate their status. Yet despite these disadvantages, Elias possessed something that set him apart from other wolves of his station. A rare gift for silent magic, the ability to weave spells without spoken words or elaborate rituals. Silent magic was both a blessing and a curse in werewolf society. While it was undeniably powerful, it was also viewed with suspicion by traditional pack leaders who preferred the straightforward, physical dominance that had governed werewolf culture for millennia. Magic users were often seen as untrustworthy, their abilities too reminiscent of the witches and warlocks that werewolves had historically viewed as enemies. For an Omega from a minor clan to possess such abilities was particularly problematic, as it challenged the established order in ways that made the pack elders deeply uncomfortable. But none of these concerns mattered to Elias when he felt the first stirrings of the fated mate bond on his 18th birthday. The pull was unmistakable, directing his attention toward Roggen Black Moon, the eldest son of the Supreme Alpha and heir to leadership of the entire Moonhaven Pack. Roggen was everything an alpha should be: tall, powerfully built, with the kind of commanding presence that made other wolves instinctively submit to his authority. His dark hair caught moonlight like spun obsidian, and his ice-blue eyes could freeze a subordinate with a single glance. For months, Elias lived with the knowledge of their bond burning in his chest like a secret flame. He watched Roggen from afar, felt the mate pull growing stronger with each passing full moon, and dreamed of the day when they would be formally bonded before the entire pack. In his most private moments, he allowed himself to imagine a future where his low birth wouldn't matter, where his magical abilities would be seen as an asset rather than a liability, where he would stand beside the most powerful alpha in the territory as an equal partner. The weaving of spirit ceremony arrived with the first snow of winter, bringing with it the ancient ritual where fated mates traditionally declared their bonds before the assembled pack. The ceremony took place in the sacred grove at the heart of Moonhaven territory, where massive oak trees formed a natural cathedral beneath the light of the full moon. Dozens of wolves had gathered in their finest ceremonial garb, their faces painted with traditional symbols and their voices raised in the old songs that had been sung at such ceremonies for centuries. As part of the ritual, potential mates exchanged magical bracelets, woven from silver thread and blessed by the pack shamans. These bracelets would glow with ethereal light if the bond between the wearers was genuine, serving as visible proof of the moon goddess's blessing on their union. Elias had spent weeks crafting his bracelet, pouring his silent magic into every thread until it hummed with power that resonated with his very soul. When the time came for unmated wolves to step forward and declare their bonds, Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs with such force that he was certain everyone in the grove could hear it. The mate bond sang in his blood with unprecedented intensity, the pull toward Roggen so strong it was almost physically painful to resist. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the culmination of months of hope and longing. Gathering every ounce of courage he possessed, Elias stepped into the circle of firelight and extended the bracelet toward Roggen. His voice, usually soft and melodious, rang out clear and strong as he spoke the ritual words. "I offer this token of my heart to Roggen Black Moon, heir of the Supreme Alpha, whom the moon goddess has chosen as my fated mate. May our bond bring strength to the pack and honor to our bloodlines." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the grove turned to Roggen, who stood frozen on the opposite side of the sacred fire. For a heartbeat, maybe two, Elias saw something flicker in those ice-blue eyes, recognition of the bond, perhaps even desire. The magical bracelet in his hands began to glow with soft silver light, responding to the proximity of its intended recipient. Then Roggen's face hardened into a mask of cold disdain. He reached out and took the bracelet, not gently as tradition demanded, but roughly, his fingers closing around the delicate silver threads like claws. The contempt in his voice was unmistakable as he spoke, ensuring that every wolf present would hear his words clearly. An Omega? Roggen's laugh was harsh and mocking. And not just any Omega, but one from the lowest of clans. One whose blood carries no honor, no strength, no value to our pack's future. He held up the glowing bracelet, letting its light illuminate his face in the firelight. This is not a bond. This is a humiliation. What happened next would be burned into Elias's memory forever. Roggen didn't simply reject the bracelet or set it aside as tradition allowed for those who chose not to accept a proposed bond. Instead, he gripped the delicate silver threads in both hands and tore them apart with deliberate, vicious force. The magical energy contained within the bracelet escaped in a burst of silver sparks that fell like tears into the sacred fire. I would rather bind myself to a witch, to a demon, to any creature of darkness before I would lower myself to accept this pathetic offering, Roggen declared, his voice carrying the full weight of his alpha authority. Let it be known that I, Roggen Black Moon, formally reject this supposed bond. The Omega may look elsewhere for a mate worthy of his station. The pain was beyond anything Elias had ever experienced. It felt as though someone had reached into his chest and ripped out his heart while it was still beating. The destruction of the bracelet severed something fundamental between them, leaving jagged edges in his soul that burned with agony. Through his empathic abilities, he could feel the shock and pity of the assembled pack washing over him in waves, mixed with darker emotions, satisfaction from those who had always resented his magical abilities, relief from rivals who were glad to see him brought low. But worse than the physical pain was the emotional devastation. This wasn't just a rejection of the bond, it was a public humiliation designed to destroy his standing in the pack forever. Roggen hadn't simply said no. He had made it clear that Elias was beneath contempt, unworthy even of basic respect, let alone the honor of being considered as an alpha's mate. Elias's father, a minor functionary in the pack's administrative hierarchy, turned his face away in shame. His younger brother simply walked away, unable to meet his eyes. Other family members scattered into the crowd, desperate to distance themselves from the stigma that now clung to their bloodline like a curse. The Omega, who had been respected for his healing abilities and magical knowledge, suddenly found himself completely alone in a circle of hundreds. The ceremony continued around him as if nothing had happened. Other couples exchanged bracelets and spoke their vows, their joy and excitement a sharp contrast to his devastation. Roggen stood tall and proud, unmarked by what he had just done, accepting congratulations from pack members who praised him for his strength in rejecting an unsuitable bond. Somehow, through sheer force of will, Elias managed to move his feet. He stumbled out of the circle of firelight and melted into the shadows at the edge of the grove, watching the celebration that he was no longer part of. The word spread quickly through the gathering. The young Omega with the strange magic had been rejected, publicly humiliated, marked as unworthy. He was Thorcast now, a werewolf term that meant cast aside, and carried implications of being tainted, cursed, fundamentally flawed. The days that followed were a nightmare of shame and isolation. Word of his rejection spread through the pack like wildfire, growing more humiliating with each telling. Everywhere he went, Elias felt the weight of judgment, the whispers that followed in his wake, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. Pack members who had once sought his help with magical problems now crossed paths to avoid him. Children who had once gathered around to see demonstrations of his silent magic now ran away when they saw him coming. The pack council met in emergency session to discuss his status. An Omega who had been rejected so publicly, especially one with magical abilities that already made many members uncomfortable, was seen as a potential threat to pack unity and stability. There were concerns that his presence would remind everyone of weakness, of the kind of unsuitable matches that could weaken the pack's bloodlines if allowed to propagate. "You bring dishonor to our clan name," his father told him during a meeting that felt more like a trial than a family discussion. "Your very presence reminds everyone of failure, of presumption beyond your station. Perhaps it would be better if you found somewhere else to make your life, somewhere your circumstances wouldn't be a constant reminder of this unfortunate incident." They stripped him of his clan name first. He was no longer Elias Thornwick of the Moonhaven pack. He was just Elias, clanless, packless, unmated. Then they came for his possessions, the small room in the communal den that had been his home since reaching adulthood. They didn't burn his belongings as they might have for a true criminal, but they made it clear that his continued presence was no longer welcome. The other Omegas who had once been his friends now treated him like a contagious disease. They feared that association with a rejected mate would bring them bad luck, would mark them as equally undesirable to potential alphas. The betas avoided him entirely, while the alphas ranged from pitying to openly hostile, depending on their relationship with Rogan and their feelings about magical abilities in general. Maybe if you had been more careful about your place, one of the pack's senior betas said as Elias gathered his few remaining possessions. Maybe if you hadn't presumed to reach so far above your station, this wouldn't have happened. Omegas like you should know better than to think an alpha of Rogan's caliber would ever consider such a match. But what was he supposed to have done? Ignored the mate bond that burned in his chest like liquid fire? Pretended not to feel the connection that was supposed to be sacred, divinely ordained? The laws of fated mates were clear. When the moon goddess decreed a bond, it was meant to be honored regardless of social station or political considerations. At least that's what the old stories claimed. Reality, it seemed, was far more complicated. After 2 weeks of steadily increasing hostility and isolation, Elias made the only choice that remained to him. On a night when storm clouds covered the moon and rain fell in sheets that would wash away his scent trail, he gathered what few possessions they had allowed him to keep and slipped away from pack territory. He headed for the wasteland, the desolate border region between werewolf territory and the domains claimed by the vampire covens. The wasteland was a place of broken stone and twisted trees, where the magic of different supernatural races had clashed so often over the centuries that the very landscape bore scars from their conflicts. Ancient ruins dotted the barren hills, remnants of civilizations that had thrived here before the Great Wars reshaped the boundaries between realms. It was a place where exiles went to disappear, where the desperate sought refuge from the societies that had cast them out. Elias found shelter in what had once been a watchtower. Its upper floors collapsed, but its lower chambers still intact enough to provide protection from the elements. The structure stood on a hill overlooking the valley that marked the unofficial border between werewolf and vampire territories, close enough to both that it belonged fully to neither. Here he began the slow, painful process of learning to survive on his own. Winter came early to the wasteland, bringing with it challenges that tested every skill he had ever learned. Food was scarce. The magical contamination of the region had driven away most normal wildlife, leaving only hardy, often dangerous creatures that were difficult to hunt safely. Water had to be carefully tested for magical corruption before it could be consumed. The cold was bitter and unrelenting, seeping through the ancient stones of his shelter, despite his best efforts to block the gaps with salvaged materials. But perhaps worst of all was the solitude. Werewolves were social creatures by nature, evolved to live in communities where individual identity was shaped by pack dynamics and shared purpose. To be alone, truly alone, for weeks and then months on end was a form of torture that Elias hadn't anticipated. He found himself talking to the walls just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. His silent magic, which had always been his greatest gift, became a cruel irony. He could weave spells without speaking, but he would have given anything just to have someone to speak to. As autumn turned to winter, Elias felt himself beginning to fade. Not just physically, though the constant struggle for survival was wearing away at his body, but spiritually and magically as well. His abilities, which had always been strongest when he felt connected to something larger than himself, began to weaken as the isolation took its toll. Spells that had once come easily now required enormous effort to maintain. His empathic abilities, which had allowed him to sense the emotions of others, found nothing to connect with in the desolate landscape. He might have simply wasted away there, becoming another forgotten casualty of the supernatural world's cruel hierarchies, if not for the night when everything changed. It was the deepest part of winter, when the cold was so severe that even his magical warming spells couldn't keep the frost from forming on the inside walls of his shelter. He had been without food for 3 days, surviving on melted snow and the last of the preservation spells he had cast on some dried meat weeks earlier. Elias was attempting to gather firewood from the twisted trees that grew near his shelter when the world suddenly tilted sideways. Malnutrition and exhaustion finally claimed their due, and he collapsed into the snow, his vision graying at the edges as consciousness slipped away. The last thing he remembered was the sound of approaching footsteps and a voice speaking in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. When he woke, he was somewhere warm and dry, lying on what felt like actual bedding rather than the pile of salvaged cloth and animal fur he had been using as a makeshift bed. The air smelled of old books and burning wood, with an underlying metallic scent that made his werewolf instincts prickle with unease. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain shot through his head and the room spun around him. "Be still," a voice said from somewhere to his left, speaking in accented English that carried the weight of centuries. "You've been unconscious for nearly 2 days. Your body needs time to recover from the abuse you've subjected it to." Elias turned his head carefully, mindful of the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him, and found himself looking at the most striking individual he had ever encountered. Tall and elegant, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the firelight and dark hair that fell in waves to his shoulders, the stranger possessed an otherworldly beauty that was both captivating and unsettling. But it was his eyes that truly commanded attention, ancient amber eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom and weariness of centuries. A vampire. Elias's blood ran cold as he realized what manner of being had found him in the snow. Vampires were legendary among werewolves for their power, their cruelty, and their complete indifference to the suffering of what they considered lesser creatures. They were apex predators who viewed other supernatural beings as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. "My name is Cassiel," the vampire said, settling into a chair beside the bed with fluid grace. "Cassiel, Night Whisper of the House of Crimson Shadows. And you, young werewolf, are either very lucky or very unlucky to have collapsed so near to my domain." "Unlucky, probably," Elias managed to croak, his voice hoarse from dehydration and disuse. "Werewolves and vampires aren't exactly known for getting along." Cassiel's laugh was like the sound of silver bells, beautiful but somehow cold. "No, we are not. In fact, under normal circumstances, I would have left you where I found you. Werewolves are messy creatures, too emotional, too tied to their primitive pack instincts. I prefer the company of beings who can appreciate subtlety and intellect." "Then why didn't you?" Elias asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Cassiel was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes studying Elias with an intensity that made the werewolf want to squirm. "Because," he said finally, "there is something about you that intrigues me. Your magic, for one thing, it clings to you like perfume, but it's unlike any werewolf magic I've encountered in my considerable existence. Silent magic, unless I'm mistaken, which is extraordinarily rare among your kind." "You know about silent magic?" "I am over 800 years old, young wolf. I have studied every form of supernatural power imaginable in my quest for knowledge and understanding. Silent magic is particularly fascinating because it requires a level of mental discipline and emotional control that most werewolves simply don't possess." Cassiel leaned forward slightly, his gaze becoming even more intense. "Which raises the question of how an Omega, from what I can only assume is a minor pack, came to develop such abilities." The casual mention of his Omega status made Elias flinch involuntarily. Even here, even among beings who weren't part of werewolf society, his designation followed him like a brand of shame. "Ah," Cassiel said, clearly noting the reaction. "I see there's a story there. One that involves considerable pain, if I'm reading your emotional resonance correctly." "It's not important," Elias said quickly, not wanting to relive the humiliation of his rejection yet again. "On the contrary, I think it's very important indeed. Pain like that doesn't come from minor disappointments or everyday setbacks. This is the kind of soul-deep anguish that comes from having one's fundamental sense of self destroyed." Cassiel sat back in his chair, his expression becoming thoughtful. "You were rejected, weren't you? Publicly and humiliatingly, I would guess." Elias closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories that Cassiel's words brought flooding back. The glowing bracelet torn apart in Roggen's hands, the laughter of the assembled pack, the way his own family had turned away in shame. It all felt as fresh and painful as if it had happened yesterday rather than months ago. I can sense the magical resonance of severed bonds, Cassiel continued, his voice gentler now. It leaves scars on the soul that are visible to those who know how to look. Someone hurt you very badly, didn't they? Why do you care? Elias asked, opening his eyes to meet the vampire's gaze. You said yourself that werewolves are messy, emotional creatures. Why waste your time with my problems? Because, Cassiel said, standing and moving to a window that looked out over a landscape of snow-covered hills. I recognize the kind of strength it takes to survive that level of devastation. Most beings would have simply given up, would have let the despair consume them entirely. But you're here, alive, fighting to survive despite everything that's been done to you. That suggests a resilience of spirit that I find admirable. He turned back to face Elias, his expression unreadable. I'm going to make you an offer, young wolf. You can remain here in my domain under my protection. In exchange, you will serve as my personal assistant, helping with research, maintaining my library, assisting with various projects that require magical expertise. You want me to be your servant, Elias said flatly. I want you to be useful, Cassiel corrected. There's a difference. A servant merely follows orders without thought or initiative. What I'm offering is more akin to an apprenticeship, an opportunity to learn and grow while contributing to something greater than mere survival. Elias considered the offer carefully. He had no illusions about his situation. Winter was far from over. His magical abilities were still weakened from months of isolation and malnutrition, and his chances of surviving on his own until spring were minimal at best. But accepting Cassiel's offer would mean placing himself under the authority of a vampire, a being whose motivations and ultimate goals were completely unknown to him. What's the alternative? He asked. I return you to where I found you and wish you well in your endeavors, Cassiel said with a slight shrug. Though I suspect those endeavors would be quite brief given your current condition and the severity of the weather. It wasn't really a choice at all, and they both knew it. Elias was being offered survival in exchange for service, and refusing would likely mean death within a matter of days or weeks. But there was something in Cassiel's manner, a quality that suggested the vampire's interest went beyond mere utility. He seemed genuinely curious about Elias as an individual, not just as a resource to be exploited. All right, Elias said finally. I accept your offer, but I want to know what I'm getting into. What exactly would my duties entail? Cassiel smiled, and for the first time, there was warmth in the expression. We'll start with the basics, cataloging and organizing my collection of magical texts. Many of them are written in languages that have been dead for centuries, which is where your magical sensitivity will prove invaluable. Silent magic users often have an intuitive understanding of symbolic languages that allows them to comprehend meaning, even when they don't know the specific vocabulary. Over the following days, as Elias recovered his strength under Cassiel's care, he began to understand the scope of what he had agreed to. The vampire's domain was a sprawling castle carved into the heart of a mountain, its chambers and corridors extending deep into the living rock. Libraries filled with ancient tomes lined the walls of countless rooms, their shelves stretching from floor to ceiling and containing knowledge accumulated over centuries of study and collection. Cassiel proved to be an exacting but not unreasonable master. He expected excellence in all things but provided the tools and guidance necessary to achieve it. When Elias struggled with a particularly complex text written in a dialect of Old High Draconic, the vampire patiently explained the grammatical structures and cultural context that made translation possible. When the werewolf's magical abilities allowed him to sense meanings that weren't apparent from the written words alone, Cassiel made careful notes and asked detailed questions about what exactly he was perceiving. But for all the intellectual stimulation of the work, Elias remained acutely aware of his status in the household. He was fed well and housed comfortably, but always in quarters that were clearly designated for servants rather than equals. Cassiel spoke to him only about work, showed no interest in his personal thoughts or feelings beyond their relevance to current projects, and maintained an emotional distance that made it clear he viewed Elias as a useful tool rather than a person. It was a form of benevolent captivity, comfortable but constraining. Elias was grateful for the vampire's intervention. Without it, he would certainly have died in the wasteland, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had simply traded one form of powerlessness for another. Instead of being at the mercy of the elements and his own failing body, he was now dependent on the whims and continued goodwill of a being whose true nature remained largely mysterious. Weeks passed in this manner, settling into a routine of scholarly work punctuated by meals taken in solitude and evenings spent reading in his assigned chambers. Elias learned to navigate the castle's labyrinthine corridors, discovered hiding places where he could practice his silent magic without observation, and gradually built up his strength through regular meals and freedom from the constant stress of survival. But late at night, when the castle was quiet and the only sounds were the distant whispers of wind through stone corridors, he often found himself thinking about the life he had lost. Not the pack that had rejected him. That pain was beginning to fade into a dull ache rather than the sharp agony it had once been, but the simple freedom to make his own choices, to go where he pleased, to be valued for who he was rather than what he could do. It was during his third month in Cassiel's service that their relationship began to shift in subtle but significant ways. They were working late one evening, attempting to translate a particularly stubborn passage about the relationship between emotional states and magical power, when Elias suddenly doubled over in pain. The translation work had required him to channel his magical abilities in ways he hadn't attempted since before his rejection, and something had gone wrong. The pain was different from anything he had experienced before, not the sharp agony of a severed mate bond, but a deep, burning sensation that seemed to originate from the very core of his magical abilities. It felt as though his power was trying to tear itself apart from the inside, responding to emotional trauma that he thought he had moved past. "What's happening?" Cassiel asked, and for the first time since Elias had known him, there was genuine concern in the vampire's voice rather than mere professional interest. "I don't know," Elias gasped, clutching his chest where it felt like his heart was being squeezed by an invisible fist. "The magic. It's fighting against itself. I think working with these emotional resonance texts is triggering something connected to my rejection." What happened next was the last thing Elias expected. Cassiel moved with inhuman speed, kneeling beside Elias's chair and placing one pale hand over the werewolf's heart. Cool power flowed from the vampire's fingers, not the warm, organic energy that Elias was familiar with from werewolf healing, but something older and more disciplined vampire magic that worked by imposing order on chaos rather than encouraging natural restoration. The pain subsided gradually, leaving Elias feeling weak but no longer in agony. But more surprising than the healing was the expression on Cassiel's face. Gone was the cool detachment he usually maintained, replaced by something that looked almost like genuine worry. "How did you do that?" Elias asked when he could speak again. "Vampire magic works differently from werewolf abilities," Cassiel explained, but he didn't move away or remove his hand from Elias's chest. "Where your magic is based on emotion and intuition, ours is founded on will and control. I was able to impose stability on your magical system until the feedback loop resolved itself. I didn't know vampires could heal. We can do many things that other species assume we cannot. The question is why your magic is responding so violently to emotional triggers. Rejection trauma shouldn't cause this kind of systemic instability unless—" Cassiel paused, his amber eyes widening slightly. "Unless the bond that was severed was far stronger than a typical fated mate connection." "What do you mean?" "True mate bonds," Cassiel said slowly, "are different from the standard fated mate connections that most werewolves experience. They're rarer, deeper, and when severed, they can cause permanent damage to both parties' magical systems. The fact that you're still able to use your abilities at all suggests either remarkable resilience or—" He trailed off, studying Elias with new intensity. "Or what? Or the bond was never truly severed, merely suppressed. If that's the case, then working with magic that resonates with emotional trauma could potentially reactivate the connection, which would explain the pain you just experienced." The implications of what Cassiel was suggesting were staggering. If the bond with Rogan hadn't been completely destroyed, if some part of it still existed buried beneath layers of rejection and pain, then Elias might still be connected to the Alpha who had humiliated him so publicly. The thought was both terrifying and strangely hopeful in ways that he didn't want to examine too closely. Is there a way to tell for certain? Elias asked. There are diagnostic spells, but they're complex and potentially dangerous. If the bond is merely dormant rather than severed, attempting to examine it magically could reactivate it entirely. Cassiel's expression became thoughtful. The question is whether you want to know the truth, regardless of what it might mean for your future. Elias considered this carefully. Part of him desperately wanted to know if some connection to Rogan still existed, if there was any possibility that the rejection hadn't been as final as it had seemed. But another part of him, the part that had learned to survive on his own and build a new identity separate from his werewolf heritage, wasn't sure he wanted to risk reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. Not yet, he said finally. If there's still a connection there, I'm not ready to deal with what that might mean. I've just started to feel like myself again, like I might be able to build something worthwhile with my life. I don't want to risk losing that progress. Cassiel nodded approvingly. A wise decision. Healing should never be rushed, particularly when it involves magical trauma of this magnitude. He finally removed his hand from Elias's chest, but didn't immediately return to his chair. You should rest for the remainder of the evening. We can continue this work tomorrow when your magical system has had time to stabilize. Cassiel, Elias said as the vampire turned to leave. Thank you for healing me. You didn't have to do that. The vampire paused in the doorway, his back still turned. No, he said quietly. I didn't, but I find that I care about your well-being more than I expected to when I first brought you here. After he was gone, Elias sat alone in the library, processing both the magical crisis he had just experienced and Cassiel's unexpected admission. The vampire had revealed something important about their relationship, acknowledging that his feelings toward Elias had evolved beyond mere professional interest. It was a small crack in the emotional walls that Cassiel maintained so carefully, but it suggested possibilities that Elias hadn't dared to consider before. Over the following days, their interactions took on a subtly different quality. Cassiel began asking about Elias's comfort and well-being, inquiring whether the work was too strenuous or if there was anything he needed. Small things, but significant coming from someone who had previously treated him with distant professionalism. More importantly, the vampire began sharing details about his own life and experiences, opening up in ways that revealed the centuries of loneliness that lay beneath his sophisticated exterior. I haven't had a meaningful conversation with another being in over 50 years, Cassiel admitted one evening as they worked together in his private study. Vampires of my age and status tend to be either rivals competing for territory and resources, or subordinates who tell me only what they think I want to hear. It's refreshing to interact with someone who isn't constantly calculating the political implications of every word. Is that why you saved me? Elias asked. Because you were lonely? Partly, perhaps, though I didn't realize it at the time. Cassiel set aside the manuscript he had been examining and looked directly at Elias. I told myself I was interested in your magical abilities, which was true but not the complete truth. Looking back, I think I recognized something in you that resonated with my own experiences of isolation and rejection. You've been rejected? Cassiel's laugh was bitter. Not in the way you were, but yes. Being an ancient vampire means outliving everyone you might care about, watching civilizations rise and fall, seeing the same patterns of fear and hatred repeated endlessly across the centuries. After a while, you stop trying to form connections because the pain of losing them becomes unbearable. The admission created a new understanding between them, a recognition of shared pain despite the vast differences in their circumstances. Elias began to see past Cassiel's intimidating exterior to the lonely being beneath, while the vampire seemed to appreciate having someone who understood what it meant to be cast aside by those who should have valued them. Their evening conversations became a regular occurrence, ranging from scholarly discussions about magical theory to more personal exchanges about their respective pasts and dreams for the future. Cassiel proved to be an excellent teacher, sharing knowledge accumulated over centuries of study, while Elias brought fresh perspectives and insights that came from his unique magical abilities and outsider status. but it was during a particularly severe winter storm that their relationship underwent its most significant transformation. The storm struck without warning, bringing winds strong enough to rattle even the ancient stones of Cassiel's mountain fortress, and snow so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet beyond the windows. For 3 days, they were effectively trapped together in the castle's inner chambers, cut off from the outside world by the fury of the elements. On the second night of the storm, Elias woke from a nightmare about his rejection, the familiar terror and humiliation feeling as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He had learned to deal with these episodes quietly, not wanting to burden Cassiel with his emotional baggage. But this time the dream had been particularly vivid and disturbing. He was attempting to calm himself through meditation when he became aware of a presence in his room. Not threatening, but definitely there, watching from the shadows near the door. His enhanced werewolf senses told him it was Cassiel, but the vampire made no move to announce himself or step into the light. "I know you're there," Elias said softly, not wanting to startle his unexpected visitor. Cassiel emerged from the shadows like a wraith materializing from darkness itself. He was dressed in simple sleeping clothes rather than his usual formal attire, and his long dark hair was unbound, making him look younger and somehow more vulnerable than Elias had ever seen him. "I heard you cry out," the vampire said quietly. "I wanted to ensure you were unharmed. Just a nightmare. They happen sometimes." Elias sat up in bed, pulling a blanket around his shoulders against the chill that seemed to permeate the stone walls. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." "You didn't disturb me. I rarely sleep deeply anyway. It's a vampire trait that comes with age." Cassiel moved closer, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light from the dying fire in the room's small fireplace. "The same dream as always?" Elias nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to describe the vivid recreation of his public humiliation that his subconscious insisted on replaying with cruel regularity. "May I?" Cassiel gestured toward the chair beside Elias's bed, and when the werewolf nodded, he settled into it with his characteristic grace. Dreams like that are often the mind's way of processing trauma that hasn't been fully resolved. In my experience, they tend to fade only when the underlying pain has been properly addressed. And how does one properly address being rejected by their fated mate in front of their entire pack? Elias asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of his voice. "By recognizing that the rejection says more about the rejecter than the rejected," Cassiel said firmly. "What was done to you was cruel and unnecessary. You deserved better, regardless of your social status or your pack's political considerations. You don't know the whole story." "Then tell me," Cassiel said simply. "All of it. Sometimes sharing the burden makes it easier to bear." So Elias told him everything. The months of feeling the mate bond growing stronger, the careful preparation of the ritual bracelet, the hope and excitement leading up to the ceremony. He described Roggen's cruel words, the deliberate destruction of the bracelet, the way his own family had abandoned him in the aftermath. He talked about the isolation that followed, the gradual erosion of his place in pack society, and finally his exile to the wasteland. Cassiel listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as the story progressed. When Elias finished, the vampire was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. "This Roggen," Cassiel said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "He sounds like a coward who was more concerned with his political image than with honoring a sacred bond. Maybe, or maybe he was right. Maybe I really was beneath his station, not worthy of being an alpha's mate." "No," Cassiel said with surprising vehemence. "Don't you dare internalize his inadequacies as your own flaws. You are brilliant, talented, resilient, and kind. Any alpha would be fortunate to have you as a mate. And the fact that this particular one was too blind and foolish to recognize your worth says everything about his character and nothing about yours." The fierce defense caught Elias off guard. He had grown so accustomed to thinking of himself as fundamentally flawed, as someone who had somehow deserved the rejection and exile that followed, that hearing someone speak of him with such conviction was almost overwhelming. "You really believe that?" he asked quietly. "I know it," Cassiel said without hesitation. "In the months you've been here, I've watched you demonstrate more intelligence, compassion, and strength than most beings show in their entire lifetimes. You've taken knowledge that would challenge scholars with decades of experience and made it accessible through your unique insights. You've maintained your kindness and gentleness despite everything you've endured. And most importantly, you've continued to grow and learn rather than allowing bitterness to consume you. Tears that Elias hadn't realized he was holding back began to flow freely down his cheeks. For the first time since his rejection, someone was telling him that he had value, that he was worthy of respect and care, that the treatment he had received was wrong rather than deserved. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't need to say anything," Cassiel replied, and to Elias's surprise, the vampire reached out and gently wiped away his tears with fingers that were cool but infinitely tender. "Just know that you are valued here, that your presence has brought light into a existence that had grown cold and empty." The moment hung between them, charged with possibilities that neither had dared to acknowledge before. Elias found himself looking into Cassiel's amber eyes and seeing something he hadn't expected, not pity or mere kindness, but genuine affection, desire, and perhaps even love. "Cassiel," he said softly, not sure what he wanted to ask, but knowing that something fundamental was shifting between them. "I know this is complicated," the vampire said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know there are dozens of reasons why anything more than what we have now would be inadvisable. The differences in our species, our ages, our social positions. The fact that you're still healing from devastating trauma. The reality that I am, at my core, a predator who could hurt you in ways that your former pack never could." "But," Elias prompted, sensing there was more. "But I find myself caring for you in ways I haven't cared for anyone in centuries. I think about your well-being when you're not around. I look forward to our conversations with an anticipation that borders on desperation. And when I see you in pain, as you were during that magical feedback incident, I feel something that I thought I had lost the capacity for long ago." "What's that?" "Fear," Cassiel admitted. "Fear of losing something precious, something irreplaceable. Fear that you might decide to leave, or that something might happen to take you away from me." Elias felt his heart racing in his chest, not with the painful intensity of a mate bond, but with something that felt clean and honest and chosen. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Even if I could leave, even if I had somewhere else to go, I wouldn't want to. This place, this life we've built together, it's the first time I've felt like I truly belonged somewhere. Even though I'm not your fated mate, even though there will never be a mystical bond compelling you to love me. Especially because of that," Elias said, reaching out to take Cassiel's hand in his own. "What I feel for you isn't about destiny or biological imperative or divine decree. It's about choice. Every day, I choose to care about you, to enjoy your company, to want to be part of your life. That seems more real to me than any bond imposed by outside forces." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, as if both of them were afraid that moving too quickly might shatter the fragile understanding they had built. But when Elias responded eagerly, pressing closer and deepening the contact, Cassiel's careful control finally gave way to the passion that had been building between them for months. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, vampire and werewolf physiology responding similarly to desire despite their different origins. Cassiel's amber eyes had darkened to the color of old gold, while Elias could feel his own pupils dilating in response to the vampire's intoxicating scent. "Are you certain about this?" Cassiel asked, his voice rough with want but still concerned about consent and consequences. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were before." "I don't want to go back," Elias said firmly. "I want to go forward, with you, as partners rather than master and servant." "Partners," Cassiel repeated, as if testing how the word felt on his tongue. "Yes, I think I like the sound of that very much indeed." What followed was the most beautiful night of Elias's life. Cassiel made love to him with a patience and skill that spoke of centuries of experience, but also with a tenderness that was entirely specific to their relationship. Through his empathic abilities, Elias could feel the vampire's emotions as clearly as his own desire. Yes, but also wonder, gratitude, and a love so deep and pure that it made his chest ache with happiness. This wasn't the desperate biological need of a fated mate bond or the shallow attraction of physical lust. This was choice made manifest, two beings who had found in each other exactly what they needed and had decided to build something beautiful together. Mine, Cassiel whispered against Elias's throat as they moved together in perfect synchronization, his voice carrying both possessiveness and devotion. Yours, Elias agreed, arching beneath him as pleasure built to impossible heights. Always yours, by choice rather than fate. In the morning, Elias woke in Cassiel's arms, feeling more complete than he ever had before. The vampire was still asleep. His usually perfect features relaxed into an expression of peace that made him look almost human. Elias took the opportunity to study his lover's face, memorizing every detail of the man who had saved him in more ways than one.
No regrets.
Cassiel asked when he finally stirred, his amber eyes opening to meet Elias's gaze. None whatsoever, Elias said, meaning it completely. You, only that it took us so long to acknowledge what was growing between us, Cassiel replied, pressing a soft kiss to Elias's forehead. I love you, Elias. I know it's soon to say it, and I know the circumstances of how we met were hardly romantic, but I've existed long enough to recognize the real thing when I find it. I love you too, Elias whispered, feeling the truth of it resonate through every fiber of his being. Not because magic compels me to, not because society expects it, but because you've shown me what it means to be valued for who I am rather than what others think I should be. Their relationship transformed completely from that point forward. They were still scholar and research assistant during working hours, but in private they were lovers and partners, equals building a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Cassiel showed Elias wonders that he had never imagined, hidden chambers filled with treasures from across the supernatural realms, magical artifacts that could bend reality itself, libraries containing knowledge that had been lost to the world for centuries. But more than that, he showed Elias that he was worthy of love exactly as he was. Not stronger, not different, not improved in any way, just himself, with all his gentleness and empathic abilities and complex relationship with his werewolf heritage. For someone who had been rejected for being insufficient, it was a revelation that changed everything about how he saw himself and his place in the world. Spring arrived early in the mountains, bringing with it new growth and the return of creatures that had hibernated through the harsh winter months. It was during one of their walks through the awakening landscape that they encountered Teo for the first time. They heard the crying before they saw him, a sound that was part child's distress and part something indefinably supernatural. Following the sound through a grove of silver birch trees, they found a small figure huddled beneath a flowering bush at the edge of Cassiel's territory. It was a young vampire, perhaps the equivalent of 8 or 9 years old in human terms, but clearly suffering from severe malnutrition and recent violence. The child's skin had the pale luminescence characteristic of vampire heritage, but it was marred by cuts and bruises that spoke of recent abuse. His clothes were torn and dirty, and when he looked up at their approach, his eyes held the kind of desperate fear that came from having nowhere left to run. "Please don't hurt me," he whispered in a voice hoarse from crying and dehydration. "I know I'm trespassing, but I didn't know where else to go. The hunters, they killed my family. I've been running for days." Elias's heart broke at the raw desperation in those words. Without thinking, he knelt down to the child's level, his healing instincts overriding everything else. "Hey there," he said softly, extending his hand palm up in a gesture of peace. "We're not going to hurt you. I'm Elias and this is Cassiel. What's your name?" "Teo," the child said after a moment of hesitation. "Teo Silverwind. My family, they're all gone. The hunters said vampires were evil, that we needed to be cleansed from the world. They had silver weapons and holy water and—" His voice broke, unable to continue. "Vampire hunters," Cassiel said grimly, his expression darkening with anger. "They've been increasing their activities lately, targeting isolated vampire families under the guise of protecting human settlements. Barbaric zealots who see all supernatural beings as abominations to be eliminated. Where will you go now?" Elias asked gently, already suspecting what the answer would be. I don't know, Teo admitted, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. I don't have any other family. I don't know any other vampires. I thought maybe I could find somewhere to hide, somewhere the hunters wouldn't look for me, but I don't know how to survive on my own. Looking at this frightened orphan child, Elias felt the same fierce protectiveness that had driven him to defend other outcasts and misfits throughout his life. Here was someone else who had been marked for destruction simply for existing, simply for being born as something that others feared and hated. You could stay with us, Elias said, glancing up at Cassiel to gauge his reaction to the impulsive offer. Instead of the objection he half expected, Cassiel's expression softened as he looked down at the traumatized child. Yes, he said immediately, kneeling down beside Elias to examine Teo's injuries with gentle hands. You can stay here, where you'll be safe from hunters and anyone else who might wish you harm. Really? Teo looked between them with the first spark of hope they had seen from him. You'd do that for me? Even though I'm not family, even though you don't owe me anything. Everyone deserves safety and care, Elias said firmly. And family isn't just about blood relations. Sometimes the most important family bonds are the ones we choose to create. Besides, Cassiel added with a slight smile, this castle is far too large for just two people. It could use the laughter and energy of someone young to make it feel more like a home. That night, as they settled Teo into rooms near their own chambers, Cassiel pulled Elias aside for a private conversation. Are you certain about this? He asked quietly. Raising a vampire child is a significant responsibility, particularly one who's been traumatized as severely as Teo has been. I'm certain, Elias said without hesitation. Cassiel, I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like the world has rejected you for things you can't control. I won't let that happen to him if I can prevent it. And you're prepared for the challenges that will come with integrating him into our household? Vampire children have complex needs, both nutritional and psychological, that will require careful attention. Then we'll learn what we need to learn. We'll adapt, we'll grow, we'll become the kind of family that he needs. Elias took Cassiel's hands in his own, looking directly into those ancient amber eyes. You said once that you recognized something in me, something that resonated with your own experiences of loneliness. Well, I see the same thing in Teo. He needs what we needed: acceptance, safety, and people who will value him for who he is rather than fear him for what he is. Cassiel studied his face for a long moment, then smiled one of his rare, genuine expressions of joy. You continue to amaze me, my love. Yes, we'll take him in. We'll give him the family and home that he deserves. Teo proved to be a remarkable addition to their household. Despite the trauma he had endured, he possessed an inquisitive mind and a resilient spirit that reminded Elias of his own determination to survive and thrive despite adversity. The child was incredibly intelligent, absorbing knowledge with the hunger of someone who had been denied education and intellectual stimulation for too long. His vampire heritage granted him abilities that were fascinating to study and potentially valuable in their magical research. Enhanced senses, limited shape-shifting capabilities, and an intuitive understanding of shadow magic that complemented Elias's silent magic in interesting ways. But more than his supernatural abilities, Teo brought something equally valuable to their strange family: pure, uncomplicated affection, and the kind of perspective that only someone young and relatively untainted by cynicism could provide. Why do people hate vampires so much? He asked one evening as the three of them sat together in the library, Cassiel reading aloud from a collection of ancient legends, while Elias worked on organizing a new shipment of manuscripts. Because they fear what they don't understand, Cassiel explained patiently. Vampires are different from humans in ways that make many people uncomfortable. We're stronger, faster, longer-lived, and we require blood to survive. That combination of power and apparent inhumanity frightens those who prefer their world to be simple and predictable. But you don't hurt people, Teo observed. You save them, like you saved Elias and me. Not all vampires are the same, Cassiel said carefully. Just as not all humans are the same or all werewolves. There are vampires who abuse their power, who see other beings as nothing more than food sources or entertainment. Those individuals give the rest of us a reputation that can be difficult to overcome. But you're not like that. No, I'm not. And neither will you be, as long as you remember that power should be used to protect and preserve, not to dominate or destroy. Watching Cassiel interact with Teo, seeing the patient care with which he answered the child's endless questions and guided his development, Elias fell in love with him all over again. The vampire who had initially seemed so cold and distant revealed depths of compassion and wisdom that made him an ideal father figure for a traumatized young vampire. But their peaceful existence was shattered one spring morning when strangers appeared at the borders of Cassiel's territory. Elias sensed them before they came into view. The familiar pack scent of werewolves mixed with anger, determination, and something that felt disturbingly like righteous fury. Werewolves, he told Cassiel and Teo as they gathered in the castle's main hall. A large group of them, at least 20, possibly more. They're not here for a friendly visit. Can you tell what they want? Cassiel asked, his demeanor shifting into something more dangerous as his protective instincts activated. Me, I think, Elias said, his heart sinking as he recognized the emotional signatures of wolves he had once known well. And they're angry about something they blame on me. The delegation that arrived at their door was led by a face Elias had hoped never to see again. Rogan stood at the front of the group, looking every inch the powerful alpha, but there was something different about him now. The arrogant confidence that had characterized his younger self had been replaced by something harder, more desperate. His ice-blue eyes held a fury that seemed barely contained, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Elias Thornwick, he said, using the clan name that had been stripped from Elias months ago. Or do you still claim that designation, despite abandoning everything it represents? I use the name I chose for myself, Elias replied, stepping forward to stand beside Cassiel. What do you want, Rogan? We want answers, another pack member interjected, his tone hostile and aggressive. Strange things have been happening in our territory and the surrounding regions. Vampire activity has increased dramatically. Supernatural creatures that should fear werewolf lands are moving freely through our forests, and the natural order that has maintained balance for centuries is breaking down. And you think this has something to do with me? Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew where this was heading. We know it does, Rogan said coldly. Ever since you disappeared into vampire territory, the barriers between our worlds have been weakening. The corruption spreads from this place like a disease, and you're at the center of it. What corruption? Cassiel asked, his voice carrying undertones of power that made several of the pack members shift nervously. What exactly are you accusing us of? You've taken one of our own. An elder werewolf stepped forward, his grizzled features twisted with disgust. Corrupted him with vampire influence, turned him against his own kind. The magical resonance of such an abomination spreads outward, weakening the natural boundaries that keep our species separate and distinct. I haven't been corrupted, Elias said firmly. I've been cared for, accepted, loved for who I am rather than rejected for failing to meet impossible standards. Love. Rogan's laugh was harsh and mocking. You call this perversion love? You've bound yourself to a creature of darkness, a predator that feeds on blood and death. What you think is love is nothing more than sophisticated predation. The insult to both him and Cassiel made anger flare in Elias's chest. But before he could respond, Teo stepped forward from where he had been hiding behind Cassiel. The pack's reaction to his presence was immediate and visceral. Several wolves actually recoiled, their expressions shifting from hostility to outright revulsion. A vampire child, one of them whispered, and Elias could hear the horror in his voice. They're not just consorting with the undead, they're raising one of their spawn. He's not spawn, Elias said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge as his protective instincts kicked in. He's a child who lost his family to hunters, who needed safety and care. We gave him both. You've created an abomination, the elder snarled. A vampire raised by werewolf magic, contaminated by your presence. The corruption spreads through him like poison through water. The only poison here is your hatred and prejudice, Cassiel said, his own power beginning to manifest as shadows gathered around his feet. Teo is an innocent child who has done nothing to deserve your condemnation, except exist in a form that challenges your narrow worldview. This ends now, Rogan declared, his alpha authority making his voice carry across the courtyard. You will return with us to face judgment for the magical contamination you've caused. The vampire will be banished from werewolf lands permanently, and the abomination will be dealt with according to ancient law. Ancient law? Elias felt ice form in his veins as he realized what Rogan was suggesting. You mean you want to kill him? Vampire children raised outside proper covens become unstable, dangerous to themselves and others, Rogan said coldly. It would be a mercy to end his suffering before he becomes a threat to innocent lives. The protective rage that swept through Elias was unlike anything he had ever experienced. This sweet, intelligent child who had brought so much joy and purpose to their lives. They wanted to murder him simply for existing, simply for being different from what they considered acceptable. No, Elias said, and his voice carried power that made even the alpha werewolves take a step back. You will not touch him. You will not threaten him. And you will leave our home immediately. Your home. Rogan stepped closer, trying to use his size and presence to intimidate. You have no home, Omega. You were rejected, cast out, abandoned by everyone who should have valued you. You're nothing but a stray that a vampire decided to keep as an interesting pet. I am more than I ever was when I lived among werewolves, Elias replied, meeting Rogan's gaze steadily. I have work that matters, love that fulfills me, and a family that chooses me freely. What do you have, Rogan? A pack that follows you out of fear rather than respect. Leadership built on intimidation and prejudice? A life so empty that you have to travel for days just to threaten someone who never wronged you. Through his empathic abilities, Elias could sense Rogan's true emotions now. Rage? Yes, but also pain and regret and a loneliness that resonated with what Elias himself had felt during his own exile. The Alpha had made his choice at the bonding ceremony, but it hadn't brought him the satisfaction or peace he had expected. I made the right choice, Rogan said, but there was doubt in his voice. The pack comes before personal desires. Did you make the right choice? Or did you make the choice that felt safer? The one that didn't require you to be vulnerable or risk your precious reputation. Elias studied Rogan's face, seeing the cracks in his composure. I know what it feels like to be afraid, Rogan. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid. And you think running away to live with vampires was courageous? I think building a new life from nothing was courageous. I think opening my heart to love again after being rejected was courageous. I think protecting an innocent child from people who want to kill him for things he can't control was courageous. Elias glanced back at Cassiel and Teo, drawing strength from their presence. But most of all, I think choosing love over hate, acceptance over prejudice, and hope over despair was courageous. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Elias could feel the conflict raging within several of the pack members, their traditional prejudices warring against the evidence of their own eyes. They had come expecting to find corruption and abomination, but instead they saw a family that genuinely cared for each other. This isn't over, Rogan said finally, but the threat sounded hollow. The pack will not tolerate this corruption on our borders. Then the pack will have to learn tolerance, Cassiel said firmly, because we're not going anywhere. This is our home, and we will defend it against anyone who threatens our family. You call this aberration a family? Yes, Elias said simply, because that's what it is. Not bound by blood or species loyalty, but chosen freely and maintained through love and mutual respect. It's not the family I expected to have, but it's the one I choose every day. As if to emphasize his words, Teo stepped forward and took Elias's hand, his small fingers interlacing with the werewolf's. The gesture was simple but powerful, a child choosing his protector, demonstrating the bonds that held their unusual household together. We choose each other, Teo said quietly, his young voice carrying surprising strength. Every day we choose to be a family. Isn't that more important than what species we are? The innocence and wisdom in his words seemed to pierce through even some of the pack members' defenses. Several of them exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of threatening a child who spoke with such sincerity about love and family. But Roggen's face hardened again as he reasserted his alpha dominance. "You have 1 week," he said. 1 week to dissolve this unnatural household and return to face judgment. If you're still here after that, we'll consider you a hostile threat and act accordingly." "We're not leaving," Elias said calmly. "This is our home. We've built a life here, and we're not abandoning it because of threats from people who refuse to look past their own prejudices." "Then you've chosen your fate." Roggen turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Elias. "I had hoped. I thought perhaps there was still time to salvage something, to bring you back to where you belong. But I can see now that the corruption has spread too deep." "There never was anything to salvage between us," Elias replied. "You made sure of that when you chose pride over love, when you decided that your image mattered more than the bond we shared." After the pack left, the three of them stood together in the courtyard of their home, processing what had just happened. The confrontation that they had feared might destroy them had instead revealed the strength of the bonds between them and confirmed their commitment to protecting each other. "Are they really going to come back and try to hurt us?" Teo asked, his voice smaller than usual but still brave. "They might," Cassiel said honestly. "But if they do, we'll be ready for them." "How can we be ready for an entire pack?" Elias asked. "There are only 3 of us. 3 of us with very particular skills," Cassiel corrected. "You have magic that can influence emotions and thoughts. I have 8 centuries of accumulated power and knowledge. And Teo has abilities that they don't understand and can't predict." "You really think we can defend ourselves?" "I think we can do more than that," Cassiel said, his amber eyes glowing with fierce determination. "I think we can show them that different doesn't mean wrong, that chosen families can be just as strong as blood families, and that love is more powerful than hatred." The week that followed was spent in careful preparation. Cassiel began teaching both Elias and Teo defensive techniques that could help them protect themselves and each other if violence became unavoidable. Elias worked on expanding his empathic abilities, learning to project emotions as well as read them. Teo practiced controlling his vampire abilities with increasing sophistication, discovering that his unique upbringing had given him access to powers that were uncommon even among his kind. But more than preparing for conflict, they used the time to strengthen the bonds between them. They talked about what their family meant to each of them, what they were willing to sacrifice to protect it, and what kind of future they wanted to build together. "I never had a real family before," Teo told them one evening as they sat together by the fire. "I mean, I had my birth family, but they were always worried about survival, about hiding from hunters. There was never time for things like reading stories or learning magic or just talking about ideas. And now," Elias asked gently, "now I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Teo said with a smile that made both men's hearts clench with protective emotion. "You're not just taking care of me because you have to. You actually want me here." "We do want you here," Cassiel said firmly. "You're not a burden or an obligation, Teo. You're our son, chosen freely and loved completely. Even though I'm different, even though I need blood to survive and can't go out in direct sunlight and have powers that most people think are evil. Especially because you're different," Elias said. "Difference is what makes you special, what makes our family unique and wonderful." When the pack returned on the 8th day, they brought more than just the original delegation. Nearly 30 werewolves emerged from the forest in battle formation, armed with silver weapons and moving with the coordinated precision of experienced warriors. At their head walked Roggen, his face set in lines of grim determination, but Elias could sense the uncertainty beneath his alpha facade. "You were given a chance to leave peacefully," Roggen called out as they approached the castle. "You chose to stay. Now face the consequences." "The consequences of what?" Elias called back, stepping forward to stand with Cassiel and Teo. "Of refusing to abandon our home? Of declining to surrender an innocent child to your prejudice. The consequences of defying the natural order," the pack elder replied. Of corrupting the boundaries between species that have kept the supernatural world stable for millennia. What we've created here isn't corruption, Cassiel said, his power beginning to manifest as shadows deepened around the castle walls. It's evolution. It's proof that beings of different species can coexist, can love each other, can build something beautiful together. It's an abomination that threatens everything our ancestors fought to preserve, Rogan declared.
Stand Aside, Vampire.
We've come for the Omega and the spawn he's corrupted with his presence. You'll have to go through me first, Cassiel said, his voice carrying undertones of power that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. The battle that followed was intense but brief. Cassiel's 8 centuries of accumulated power proved devastating against opponents who relied primarily on physical strength and traditional weapons. Shadows obeyed his will, darkness became solid enough to block attacks, and his vampiric speed made him nearly impossible to target effectively. Elias contributed by using his empathic abilities to project confusion and doubt into the attacking wolves, making them question their motivations and hesitate at crucial moments. Teo, despite his youth, proved surprisingly effective at creating diversions and providing support through his developing shadow magic. But it was when one of the pack members broke through their defenses and lunged toward Teo with a silver dagger that the true power of their bond was revealed. Elias felt something snap inside him, a protective rage so intense it manifested as visible energy that knocked the attacker back with enough force to send him flying into a stone wall. Enough! Elias shouted, his voice carrying power that froze every wolf on the battlefield. This stops now. He walked forward until he stood in the center of the courtyard, facing down the entire pack with nothing but the force of his will and the depth of his conviction. You came here looking for corruption, he said, his voice carrying to every ear present. You came looking for abomination, for evidence that love between different species is wrong or unnatural. But what have you actually found? He gestured toward Cassiel and Teo, who stood together watching him with expressions of pride and absolute trust. You found a family, not perfect, not traditional, but real. You found beings who choose each other every day, who support each other through difficulties, who protect each other from those who would do them harm. His gaze fixed on Rogan. You found love that doesn't require compulsion or biological imperatives to sustain it. Love, Rogan scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. You call this perversion love? I call it the strongest force in any realm, Elias replied. Strong enough to heal wounds you thought were permanent. Strong enough to build bridges between worlds that have been separate for centuries. Strong enough to make someone who was broken and rejected into someone who knows their own worth. He took a step closer to Rogan, close enough to see the conflict raging in those ice-blue eyes. You want to know what corruption looks like? It looks like rejecting someone for being different. It looks like threatening to murder a child because his existence challenges your worldview. It looks like choosing hatred over understanding, fear over growth, isolation over connection. Through his empathic abilities, Elias began projecting the emotions he had experienced during his time with Cassiel and Teo. The joy of being accepted, the security of unconditional love, the satisfaction of contributing to something larger than himself. One by one, the attacking wolves began to lower their weapons as they felt what real family bonds could be like. This is what you could have, Elias continued, his voice gentler now. Not just you, Rogan, but all of you. This is what the world could be like if we stopped fearing difference and started celebrating it. The transformation in the assembled pack was remarkable. Several wolves were openly weeping, overwhelmed by the intensity of the positive emotions Elias was sharing. Others looked around with new understanding, seeing their companions not as part of a unified attacking force, but as individuals with their own fears and hopes and potential for growth. You're offering us a chance to change, one of the younger pack members said slowly, to be part of something new. I'm offering you a chance to choose, Elias replied. The same choice I made when I decided to build a life based on love, rather than letting rejection define me forever. Rogan stood silent for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was wrong, he said. About everything. About you, about what strength really means, about what's best for our pack. He looked directly at Elias. I was a coward, and I made you pay for my fear. You were afraid, Elias said gently. There's a difference. Fear can be overcome if you're willing to try. Can it? Can someone like me, someone who's caused so much pain, really change? Everyone can change, Teo said, stepping forward with the fearless honesty that only children possessed. Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were before. Rogan looked down at the vampire child, and for the first time, his expression softened with something that might have been wonder. You would forgive me? After I threatened to kill you? I would forgive you if you really meant to be different, Teo replied. That's what families do. They forgive each other and help each other grow. Family? Rogan repeated, as if testing how the word felt on his tongue. Is that what you're offering? A chance to be part of this experiment in belonging? We're offering acceptance, Cassiel said, moving to stand beside Elias and Teo. For those who genuinely want to be part of something based on choice rather than tradition, love rather than fear. Several pack members stepped forward, their faces showing varying degrees of hope and uncertainty. What would that mean exactly? One of them asked. How would it work? We'd figure it out together, Elias said simply. All of us working to build something new. A community where species doesn't matter as much as character, where family is defined by commitment rather than genetics. And those who aren't ready for such changes? Rogan asked. They return to the old ways, Cassiel replied. No judgment, no condemnation, just a different path. In the end, roughly half the pack chose to return to traditional werewolf territory, while the others remained to become part of the growing community that was forming around Cassiel's castle. Rogan himself chose to stay, not as an alpha seeking to reclaim dominance, but as someone genuinely committed to learning a different way of existing. The months that followed were challenging as they worked to integrate werewolves, vampires, and other supernatural beings into a functioning community. There were conflicts, misunderstandings, and moments when it seemed like the experiment might fail entirely. But gradually, slowly, they built something unprecedented, a society based on chosen family rather than blood ties, on acceptance rather than conformity. Elias and Cassiel formalized their relationship in a ceremony that combined vampire bonding traditions with werewolf pack customs, creating something entirely new to mark their commitment to each other. Teo was formally adopted as their son, not just in practice but in magical law that recognized their non-traditional family structure. Do you ever regret it? Cassiel asked one evening as they stood together on the castle's highest balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Below them, their community went about its evening routines, vampires and werewolves working side by side, children of different species playing together, families that defied every traditional category. Regret what? Elias asked, though he suspected he knew what his partner meant. Leaving behind the possibility of a traditional werewolf life. Giving up the chance to have what your original pack might have considered normal. Never, Elias said firmly, turning to face the vampire who had become his anchor and his home. What we have here, what we've built together, it's better than anything I could have imagined when I was young and foolish enough to think that fate mattered more than choice. Even without a mystical bond compelling us to love each other? Especially without that, Elias replied, reaching up to frame Cassiel's face with his hands. Every day I choose you. Every day I choose this life, this family, this community we've created. That seems infinitely more meaningful than any bond imposed by outside forces. And Teo? Do you think he's happy with the choices we've made for him? As if summoned by their conversation, Teo appeared on the balcony behind them, now several years older and more confident, his vampire abilities fully developed but tempered by the wisdom and compassion they had instilled in him. Are you talking about me again? He asked with the mock exasperation that teenagers had perfected across all species. We were wondering if you felt like you belonged here, Elias said gently. If you were happy with the life we've built together. Teo's expression grew serious as he considered the question. You know what I remember most about before you found me? He said finally. The fear. Constant, overwhelming fear that someone would discover what I was, that I'd be hurt or killed or driven away. I remember feeling like I was wrong somehow, like there was something fundamentally broken about my existence. He moved to stand between them, looking out over the community they had all helped to create. Here, I've never felt that way. Not once. I felt challenged, frustrated, excited, proud, sad, angry. All the normal emotions that come with growing up, but never wrong. Never like I was a mistake or an abomination. He smiled at both of them. You gave me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that I belong somewhere, that I'm valued for who I am rather than feared for what I am. So you're happy we made you stay that first day? Cassiel asked with a slight smile. I'm happy you gave me a choice about whether to stay, Teo corrected. And I'm happy that every day since then, I've chosen to be part of this family. That's what real love is, isn't it? The choice to keep choosing each other, looking out over their impossible community, their chosen family, their love that had grown from rejection and exile into something that was reshaping the supernatural world. Elias felt a contentment deeper than anything he had ever imagined possible. He had been cast out for being insufficient, for failing to meet someone else's standards of worthiness. But in losing everything he thought he wanted, he had found everything he actually needed. Yes, he said softly, taking both Cassiel's and Teo's hands in his own. That's exactly what love is. In the distance, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Elias couldn't help but think of an old werewolf saying about how the darkest nights often produced the brightest lights. He had learned the truth of that in the most personal way possible, that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that began with loss and grew into something that transformed not just the lovers themselves, but the entire world around them. Come on, Cassiel said eventually, pressing a kiss to Elias's temple. Let's go inside. I have a new manuscript I want to show both of you, a prophecy about beings who bridge different worlds and the communities they create. A prophecy about us? Teo asked with excitement. Perhaps, Cassiel replied with mysterious smile. Or perhaps about what we're going to become. As they made their way back into the castle, Elias reflected on how much his life had changed since that terrible night when Rogan had torn apart his bonding bracelet. The Omega who had been rejected as unworthy had become a bridge between worlds, a healer of ancient divisions, a father to an extraordinary child, and the beloved partner of a being who had waited centuries to find love. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. And best of all, it was chosen freely, maintained through daily commitment, and strengthened by the knowledge that what they had built together was not decreed by fate or biological imperative, but created through the most powerful force in any realm, the decision to love completely, accept unconditionally, and choose hope over despair no matter what the world might throw at them. In the end, that was the greatest magic of all.